Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Machuda.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, and it's great to be with you today to talk about explaining, defending the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence, and got a great show in store for you today. You know, all the shows are great. This is one of those programs that, God willing, it's not only a good program, but it's good for you. Because I was thinking about this today. If you regularly listen to the show, you will learn an awful lot of different informal fallacies. You'll learn the biographies of pretty much all the early church fathers. And on top of that, you're going to have some top-rate intel from people in the field who specialize in apologetics. And today's guest is one of those. It's our good friend, Pat Flynn. As you know, Pat is the purveyor of chroniclesofstrength.com. His expertise is in weightlifting, fitness training. But he's also a convert. He was an atheist and a studied convert into theism. I mean, he really hit the books. And what I love about Pat is, that's just not a thing that happened in his past. He's constantly thinking about new and better ways to explain the existence of God and how to make the case for theism. So he's incredibly articulate, incredibly sharp, and like I said, I love apologists who spend time getting work in the field, actually digging in, researching. And anyway, he was recently on a show, which is Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd, who is also a good friend of the show. We had him on a few weeks ago. I was listening to his interview because I'm always learning new things. And Pat broached the subject that I thought was very fascinating. In fact, I asked him to come on the show today and kind of expound on it and kind of drill down, because he was talking about how, from an atheist standpoint, there is a kind of categorical barrier that just can't be crossed. This barrier is like many different facets of it. For example, like moving from inorganic matter to organic matter, and all sorts of things like that. And he was so articulate, he just spit it out. It's one of those gold nuggets during the interview with Matt. And but I thought, this is something that I haven't heard before. I think it's potentially very helpful. And so Pat's going to be coming on the other side of the break. We're going to talk about atheism's category barrier. And, of course, that's coming up on the other side of the break. In the meantime, we're going to learn yet another informal fallacy, and today's finding the fallacy is the no true Scotsman fallacy. So hopefully Michelle's out there, you're listening. Our good friends in Scotland. Also, we meet an early church father. Today's early church father is St. Gregory the Great. So he is a great early church father indeed. Just a fascinating biography, not to mention all the awesome letters and other material that he's left us. So got our schedule filled to the brim with lots of great training, apologetics training. And so why don't we begin? First, I want to welcome you all back to the dojo, starting with all of you that are watching live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and the other platforms we live stream on. Welcome aboard, folks. Also, I want to welcome all of you listening on radio around the country and also via podcast around the world. Welcome aboard. It's great to have you with us. And, I love the social media aspect of the program because we're doing apologetics in place here, folks. And that means using social media to defend the church, explain Catholic teaching, and make Jesus better known and loved. That's the ultimate bottom line here. And so I want to thank all of you for subscribing to the Hands-On Apologetics channel on YouTube. Also for, doing thumbs up, liking, telling your friends, sharing podcasts, that type of thing. Also adding comments in the comment section too also helps visibility, and all those things you could do. Maybe take 1 or 2 minutes. You won't even have to leave the chair that you're sitting on right now. You can help better share, explain the faith, get people involved, because that's what it's all about, folks. That's what it's all about. All right, so without further ado, why don't we jump to the finding of the fallacy? And the name of the fallacy is called the No True Scotsman fallacy. And if you're a regular listener, you know that informal fallacies often have a number of different names. It's also known as the appeal to purity. There's a couple other titles too. It's very close to the moving the goalpost fallacy. But what is the No True Scotsman fallacy? Well, it's an informal fallacy in which one attempts to protect a universal generalization against counterexamples by changing the definition in an ad hoc fashion so as to exclude those counterexamples. Okay, so let me give you the classic No Scotsman example, and that is person A says, "No Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge," to which person B said, "But my Uncle Angus is a Scotsman, and he puts sugar on his porridge." To which person A replies, "But no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge." So you see here where he makes a general statement about Scotsmen and how they like their porridge. A counterexample is raised where someone within the category of a Scotsman is used as a counterexample to that generalization. And then you have person A again committing the No True Scotsman fallacy by adding the qualification that, well, it's not all Scotsmen, but all true Scotsmen. Okay. So in a sense, he redefines his original position in order to avoid counterexamples. This occurs an awful lot. It's very easy to do an ad hoc adjustments while you are arguing for a position. You just have to be aware of it and be aware if someone is doing that. Because basically what you do is you can never lose an argument if you just keep making all these ad hoc adjustments as you go on so as to exclude any possible counterexample. And ultimately you end up with an unfalsifiable position, which really isn't a position based on evidence. It's really just a position based on your sheer willpower that it is true, and I know it's true, that no true Scotsman puts sugar on his porridge. So that is our finding the fallacy for today, the No True Scotsman fallacy. Why don't we jump to the Meet the Early Church Father? Today's early church father is a great early church father in that he is St. Gregory the First, also known as St. Gregory the Great, who is Pope. He reigned from AD 590 to 604. Pope St. Gregory was born at Rome about the year 540. He was a son of a celebrated and wealthy family. Early in his life, he held a political office in Rome, and he seemed to have a brilliant secular career before him. And he had long wrestled inwardly, however, with the problems of the evangelical councils and of the citizen of the city of God as a resident in the secular city. Finally, he renounced all his worldly aspirations, sold his inherited possessions, and the proceeds of which were distributed to the poor, and likewise used for the building of 7 monasteries, 6 on his family estate in Sicily, and the 7th dedicated to the patronage of St. Andrew in his parental home in Rome. It was here in the 7th monastery on Mount Cielo, where he himself resided as a monk, practicing the rule of St. Benedict in such great austerity that he destroyed his health and endangered his very life. Yet in the later years, he looked back with nostalgia and sorrow about the joy he had being a monk. He speaks about it as being the happiest times of his life. Gregory also spent only a comparative short time in this monastic retreat when he was called upon by Pope Benedict I from 574-578 to serve him as a regional deacon. Under Benedict's successor, Pope Pelagius II, Gregory was made in 579 the ambassador of sorts to Constantinople, the court of Emperor Tiberius II. Only in 585 was Gregory able to return to his monastery, where he soon was made abbot. When Pope Pelagius died of the plague in February 590, Gregory was called to succeed him by unanimous vote and acclaim of the Roman clergy, Senate, and people. He sought to escape this burdensome office, but was finally consecrated September 3rd, 590. And thank God for that, too. St. Gregory was Bishop of Rome for 14 years. Only 2 popes are given the title the Great: Leo I, his predecessor of a century and a half, and Gregory himself. It was Gregory who led antiquity into the Middle Ages and who led the foundations of the medieval papacy that governed the Western world after the culmination wars and invasions that had completed the fall of the Western Empire in the 6th century. So basically, the whole Western world, Western civilization was in tatters when Pope St. Gregory took office, and really is under his spiritual leadership that Europe came back to what eventually became the Middle Ages and the High Middle Ages. It was also Gregory who first habitually styled himself as Pope as the servant of servants of God. And so that is our Meet the Early Church Father for today. A great early church father indeed, Pope St. Gregory the Great. And talk about great people, we have our very good friend Pat Flynn coming on the other side of the break. We're going to talk about atheism and the category barrier that atheists face. Stay tuned, folks. More to come after the break.
Jesus said in Matthew 26, "Stay awake and pray that you may not enter into temptation." According to St. Ephrem, Jesus, who feared nothing, experienced fear and asked to be freed from death, although he knew it was impossible. How much more must we persevere in prayer before temptation assails us, so that we may be freed when the test has come? May God grant that we may withstand temptation and carry out His will in all things.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, folks, to Hands On Apologetics. And let's talk about atheism. You know, usually we're given proofs for the existence of God, things from the theistic side of the equation, but we haven't really spent a lot of time on the other side of the equation. In fact, there is some difficulties. If you don't believe in God, like the old I Love Lucy show, you have a lot of explaining to do in regards to explaining things around us, and that is this category barrier. And to help us talk a little bit about that, we have our very good friend, master apologist, Pat Flynn, on the show. Pat is the host of the Pat Flynn Show that covers everything from fitness, mental health, to business, to writing, philosophy, and theology. He's a best-selling author, philosopher, fitness coach, magician, musician, not magician, and entrepreneur, but you probably could add magician in there somewhere. He expounds on the theory of generalism, and also he's just a great guy, a wealth of knowledge. And check out his stuff, folks, at chroniclesofstrength.com. Pat, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here, Gary, as always. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you know, I was really excited to see that you were on the I almost said Pat Flynn Show. I'm excited about that, but with Matt Fradd and Pints with Aquinas, that was a great interview.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a total blast to be on his show. And we covered a lot of territory. He mostly just interviewed me about how I moved from being a skeptic to now being a Catholic, which just invited a whole host of conversational topics. So it was a ton of fun. I thank Matt for being such a gracious and easy host. He's like you, Gary. He's just one of those guys. It's just really easy to talk to. You could just keep going and going. But yeah, it was a ton of fun.
Well, thanks. That's a high compliment. You talked about everything. I mean, even I think at one point you were talking about heavy metal music, yet it was still in context with with the whole topic. And you mentioned something really fascinating, and that's why I asked you back on the show about this. There's a category barrier that if you start with a materialistic, atheistic, naturalistic view, there's certain jumps that you have to make that are not just difference in degree, but actually difference in kind. They're different categories altogether. I don't know where you want to start with this, so I'll let you go.
Well, let me give some background. So for people who haven't seen the interview, Matt was, if I remember rightly, I think he was asking me what gave me difficulties with the atheistic worldview when I was still, kind of in that camp, I guess you could say. Yeah. And one of the things that I brought up is that the deeper I went in and started probing the sort of metaphysical commitments of a materialist or physicalist or reductionist worldview, I don't want to say all atheists are committed to that worldview, but many are. And that was sort of the direction I was heading. I eventually discovered what is sometimes called a serious construction problem. That given the sort of categories of the types of things that are on hand in this worldview, or whatever we are supposed to think about fundamental reality of what it is composed of, we're gonna have an issue, right? Because it doesn't seem to line up with many aspects of our experience. And I think there's three good examples that we could jam on in this conversation. One is consciousness. One is morality, and the other is contingency. And I think for any three of these things, well, there's two ways you can look at it. You could say, given the sort of fundamental metaphysical commitments of a sort of atheistic, materialist, physicalist worldview, maybe it's impossible. Maybe it's impossible to jump from those commitments to consciousness, for example, or an objective moral realm. That's a very strong way of putting it. But I like bold claims, and I think that seems right to me. I think when you really think about it, it is impossible to jump that sort of qualitative chasm. That's what we're talking about, right? How do you make a qualitative leap? And the example that I gave in Matt Fradd's show, just to kind of kick this conversation off, is if you're thinking about consciousness, just in a very general sense, there's certain aspects of consciousness that are just that we're directly aware of. For example, that we are directly aware, right? That we have awareness. That's one aspect of consciousness. Also, that it's irreducibly unified, right? That's another aspect. So it's not disparate. It's a unified reality. It's intentional. It's directed. We have thoughts about things. right? So these are just things that we can immediately apprehend about our conscious experience. But then, on the other hand, if you're committed to a sort of reductionist, physicalist worldview, what's supposed is that whatever else reality is at bottom is sort of a disparate collection of fundamental physical simples. Now, some atheists may commit to what those physical most fundamental realities are. Maybe somebody will say, well, it's particles of some sort, like fermions and bosons. Others may leave it open and say, maybe it's not those specifically, but it's going to be some dumb physical thing, right? And it's not going to have intentionality. It's not going to have consciousness. It's not going to have unity. And then when you think about this, you can start to see the construction problem. Well, how do we go from that to essentially its complete qualitative opposite? I mean, it really is almost its complete qualitative opposite, right? And the analogy that I think can help people understand the difficulty here would be something like this. Imagine you have a pile of white Lego blocks, and imagine you have all the time in the world, and you have all the Lego blocks in the world, but they're all white. Does time or chance or the number of Lego blocks, does that help at all if you need to construct a green tower? And I think most people will recognize almost immediately, no, time and chance aren't going to help at all, because we have a qualitative chasm here that seems like we cannot traverse this in principle. And that's kind of the stronger claim. I think that given the commitments of a sort of reductionist, physicalist worldview, I think I do want to say, yeah, that's impossible, right? Like, we're just never going to make that qualitative leap. Now, you don't have to take that strong of a claim. You could just argue that it's vastly less probable and still have a very good probabilistic argument in favor of theism. And people can decide which way they want to go, which direction they want to go. I think probably at first I thought it was improbable, and the more I've thought about it, I think I land in the stronger camp now of just saying, no, there's just no way that we're ever going to get this done. So that's just kind of an overview of what I think the problem fundamentally is, and we can maybe dive into some further details.
Yeah, I like your analogy of the Lego blocks, because in a very weird way, it is kind of, when it comes to consciousness, it is a lot like the Lego blocks, except instead of trying to build a green tower, you're trying to build a conscious tower. You know, it doesn't matter how many Lego blocks you use, as long as they're within the category of just nonsensient stuff. You know, you're just never going to do that level.
Yeah, and I want to drive the problem home here, because it's not like, it's one thing to build something of enormous complexity, right? Say a tower that is just really ornate and complex in its structure, just given time and chance, no organizing mind behind it. That itself seems very difficult to not logically impossible, but it seems unlikely, right? Especially when we're giving something like the human neural network, right? Like, okay, maybe it's logically possible, it's conceivable, but given the amount of time we've had and all the number of configurations we could have gone through, it does seem unlikely. But the problem is worse than that. It's not a matter of just physical organization, of having things in the right place. The problem is qualitative, in the sense that it doesn't even seem like we have a conceivable path, that there's an enormous chasm here of what we're saying fundamental reality is at bottom, and then essentially getting something from nothing, right? Mm-hmm. And the proposals, I think, from various atheists on this are very telling, because they actually recognize the problem, I think, quite forcefully, in the sense that I always point to my favorite group of renegade philosophers, our friends the eliminativists, right? And these are the atheists who are so committed to a reductionist worldview, and they recognize this difficulty. They recognize, like, how could you ever have dumb particles somehow add up to a conscious person or a conscious experience? They recognize that difficulty, but rather than questioning the presumption that reality is just fundamentally kind of nonsense on the ground floor, the basement of reality, they just deny consciousness. And so rather than trying to explain consciousness, they just explain it away. Persons don't exist. Consciousness doesn't exist. Consciousness is an illusion. And I think once you try and go there, it's just a very swift descent into nonsense. But people take that position, and I appreciate that position. I think it's ludicrous, but I appreciate it because it recognizes the same problem. They appreciate the problem. So it's not just a problem that theists recognize. This is a problem that atheists themselves recognize, and that's why you have people who are eliminativists.
Yeah. Are there other camps besides the eliminativists that have a different atheistic solution for the problem of consciousness?
Yeah, you have emergentist solutions, other reductionist solutions. I say solutions very loosely. I don't think that they're really solutions. So, you have kind of like supervenience theories, where the idea maybe that consciousness is kind of like a mosaic, right? You kind of have the different tiles of a mosaic, and then you have this kind of bigger picture that emerges from it, but it's reducible to the kind of smaller tiles in the mosaic. Well, the problem there is even in a mosaic, you still have the qualitative categories on hand in the smaller parts. Right. So it's not a relevant analogy. It's disanalogous, because that isn't the case of what's being proposed. So I don't think that those are really viable solutions at all. I think they miss the severe difficulty of the problem. And then on the other end, and I mentioned this in Matt Fradd's podcast, he didn't pursue it very far, but I mentioned what I call theism light. And these would be certain atheists who have really just started to revert back to a general theist worldview. They start to say, okay, maybe we do need things like teleology, and maybe we do need consciousness on hand at the foundation. Like maybe it's like proto-consciousness or panpsychism or stuff like that. Now, I think that there are difficulties with these views, and I think that they're ultimately insurmountable unless you're a theist. But I want to acknowledge that not all atheists are committed or endorsing the eliminativist position. But still, by kind of moving back towards the traditional views of formal causality and final causality, to me that's progress, and it's still recognizing the difficulty and the insurmountable problems of a thoroughly reductionist worldview. So I kind of want to celebrate that because to me it's moving back in the right direction. Say, okay, well, we're not quite there yet. God is still a much better explanation. But if you're at panpsychism, to me that's generally moving in a better direction than, say, where the eliminativists are at. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. At least then you start having some tools that you can work with that would ultimately plug into theism, where if you just deny it and say, well, consciousness is just a, some sort of hallucination, phenomenon that just occurs, then there really isn't any bridge to build. It's just a denial of the problem.
Yeah, consciousness is, you brought up epiphenomenalism, it kind of just floats atop the physical processes. And so there are different models, right? But I think that they all ultimately fail because of the same reasons or similar reasons that we've been talking about.
Very good. We're chatting with Pat Flynn, and more to come on the other side of the break, folks. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR, live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family. Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. We're chatting with Pat Flynn of chroniclesofstrength.com. And, just talking about this interesting, I guess you could say, category barrier that if you are committed to an atheistic worldview, there's just certain things you can't cross over to affirm that seems, apparent to our everyday real life experience. And Pat, you were talking about the consciousness problem, but there's problems in other areas too.
Yeah, so I said, consciousness, contingency, and morality. These were three big things for me. And sometimes atheists or skeptics might want to bite the bullet. And I think it's really hard to do that with things like consciousness and contingency. I think it's hard to do it with morality as well, and just say that there are no objective moral facts. There is no objective moral standard or something like that. You don't get as much of, I think, an upfront contradiction from that. But you're certainly going to live in a very weird space, right? You're going to be in a constant performance contradiction with yourself, because we really can't live in a world where we aren't making moral assessments, praise, blame. I mean, we're social, political animals that do this all the time. But yeah, let's talk. If you want, we can talk about the moral issue as well. And it's very similar in structure. And the idea is that we seem to live in a world where there is some type of where things like badness exists, right? And we often hear this as a claim from skeptics and atheists that the badness we experience, the fact that there is evil and bad things and suffering, and because suffering is bad, that this counts as evidence against the existence of God. This is the perennial problem of evil. But I think if we think about this from the framework of a construction problem or of a construction project, we can actually flip that argument around and show that our experience of badness actually points towards the existence of God rather than away from the existence of God, just based on a pretty simple degree of expectation. And it would work something like this, right? In the sense that, parallel to the consciousness example, if fundamental reality at bottom really just consisted of these kind of physical symbols, right? Would I ever expect any type of moral standard to emerge from that? And it's really hard to see how that could ever be the case. And then it's not just a moral standard that I'm thinking about, but also moral communities. Right. And then embedded in that is consciousness itself. Right. Like you can't even have moral communities that reflect on the moral standard unless we have consciousness, conscious beings with rationality as well. So there's another construction problem. If there's no rationality at the foundation, would I ever expect rationality to emerge or result? And it seems like the answer is just an obvious no to all of these. And it's not just one problem. It's just a compound of problems. To even get moral communities, we have other aspects of reality that we need that themselves face construction problems. So it's just layer upon layer of construction difficulty with this sort of mechanistic materialist worldview. However, if God of the classical theism exists, God who just is goodness itself, who just is perfect love itself, perfect justice itself, perfect wisdom itself. Well, now, I mean, that just seems like the moral standard that I've been searching for. And that's one of, I think, the benefits of classical theism and divine simplicity is whatever is in God is God. So whatever God's goodness is, just is God. And God being unrestricted, unbounded is perfect goodness, unlimited goodness, perfect justice, unlimited justice. So now it's not like God is under some standard higher than himself, right? So we can avoid the Euthyphro dilemma with classical theism and divine simplicity. God doesn't will things because they're good, and things aren't good just because God wills them. Rather, God is the good. He just is the moral standard. So if that God exists, might I expect the moral standard? Yeah, well, actually, it seems like I very much might expect that moral standard. And might I also expect moral communities? Is it reasonable to think that maybe that God might have reasons to create and to create beings like us? I think that's entirely plausible. And then to even make sense of badness at all, remember, to make sense of badness, we need that moral standard, right? So if I wouldn't expect the moral standard on atheism, I can't really even make sense of badness. So a commitment to badness is, I would argue, a commitment to the moral standard. And then we're kind of back to that fundamental question of what worldview better predicts a moral standard. And to me, it seems trying to think of a word here, a gajillion times more probable at the very least that theism better predicts it. We might even go stronger and say that we're just never going to get it. It's impossible on atheism. But I kind of like staying on the level of the probabilistic arguments because it flips the probabilistic arguments against God on its head, where people will say, well, the experience of evil, okay, maybe it doesn't logically disprove God, but it makes God vastly improbable. But if you think about it in the way that we're thinking about it, on an even deeper level, it actually inverts that. It inverts that conclusion. It says, no, actually, our experience of badness, when we really analyze it on the most fundamental level, lends far more support to a theistic hypothesis than an atheistic hypothesis, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. I was trying to think, what is the root of this? If everything's reduced to like you said, these simples things, obviously they're undirected. They are basically chaos, produced by chaos. So how do you move from that to any kind of, morality kind of supposes a kind of coherence, right? I mean, so I guess any coherence that would come out of chaos would be serendipitous. It would just be, oh, this is interesting. Here's a bunch of things that just so happen to fit together. I'm just trying to look from the atheist perspective. How do they move from there to, like you said, all these different levels of barriers?
Right, or even if it was serendipitous, or let's steelman it. Let's say, okay, what are some possible atheist responses here? Well, I guess you could try and be a Platonist, and I did bring this up on Frad's podcast. Yeah. And I think this is the best alternative, honestly, but I still think it fails. Like, what obligations do I have to an abstract concept? And what are the causal relations between this sort of abstract realm of the good? How does kind of love just surreptitiously supervene on whatever me and my wife are doing? Like, there's all sorts of problems with sort of atheistic moral Platonism. Again, I want to acknowledge, I think that's a move in the right direction, because that itself, the part of the reason I think that worldview is adopted is because certain thinkers realize how fundamental morality is. Like, we really can't jettison this. So we need some type of metaphysical framework to at least give us some plausible grasp of the moral realm. So I think that's going to have its own set of insurmountable difficulties. But that is one plausible way that somebody might try to hold on to an objective moral realm. But I think it in itself is, of course, it is essentially giving away materialism, right? I mean, we're out of that camp at that point. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to go to Platonism, you might as well just go to theism. It's a much simpler theory. It's a much more plausible theory. It's got many more arguments in favor of it. It's a cleaner theory. We can make sense of causal connections. I just cannot think of a reason why somebody would adopt Platonism over theism unless, and I don't want this to sound uncharitable, unless they just don't want to commit to God's existence. I just don't see why somebody would stop there. Whereas part of the attraction of a very reductionistic, mechanistic worldview is a very clean, very few commitments there, right? It makes sense why people might want to adopt that worldview, because it's very tidy in a sense. It's very lean. The problem is, in making something very tidy and lean, you just make an explanatory mess of everything else that we need to explain. It's just absolutely inadequate in terms of its explanatory depth and power. So yeah, just to be fair, there's different ways. Not all atheists are committed to the same position. And yeah, I think I said on Matt Fradd, like if I were committed to being, a theistic skeptic, I guess Platonism would probably be the way I would have to try and go if I was still going to try and hold on to morality, even though I don't think it ultimately is gonna work.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it reminds me of was it Thales, the pre-Socratic philosopher, who gave a very neat, tidy explanation of everything. That everything is just water, and there you go.
Perfect.
Very nice. No commitments really, other than the commitment that everything is essentially water.
It is. Well, it's like determinism as well, and people think that determinism is like something that just atheists affirm, but no, there's theistic determinists as well. Some Calvinists are determinists, and in a sense, that's much cleaner. It's much simpler. There's not, I guess, as much work to do, except for our experience of being free creatures. Right? It makes a huge mess of something that just seems obviously true to us. So yeah, we might have to do a little bit more work. Might be a little bit more metaphysical heavy lifting there. A little bit more we have to try to explain, maybe some more metaphysical commitments we might have to take on. But we need to do that to do justice to the world we actually live in. So I think that's another example. Like simplicity is good. We want lean theories, but simplistic is bad, right? If we start making an explanatory mess of things, then I think we should re-examine, maybe fatten it up a little bit, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a great distinction too between simple, because we're familiar with what Occam's razor and parsimony and all that, but simplistic is different. It's just it's inadequate, right? It's just a Band-Aid that you put on a wound without fixing what's the problem.
Yeah, and I mean, let's just think about it. My friend Tim McGrew gives an example of this in history. It's like you can give an account of history without Abraham Lincoln in it, and you have less ontological commitments at that point. You have one less literal person. It's leaner. It's simpler. But now you've made an absolute mess, right, of American history, of world history. We need Lincoln in there, right? So right. I think that's a really insightful example. It's like, yeah, we can give leaner ontologies, we can have less metaphysical commitments, but are we then going to be able to explain everything that we want to explain? Now, I also want to push back against that because, and I think in the most fundamental sense, if we're committed to classical theism and God is absolutely simple, non-composite, I don't think you can really get a much better, leaner, and explanatorily ultimate and satisfying explanation than that.
Yeah, very good. I agree totally. And we are chatting with Pat Flynn of chroniclesofstrength.com. Check it out, folks. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics. We will be right back.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tear and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
Healthcare news today seems to be coming from everywhere and everyone. It's confusing at least and untrustworthy at the worst. Dr. Aceta is a faithful Catholic in the Kern County community. He is trustworthy, well-researched, and will only give expert opinion on matters in his own specialty. Catholic teaching at its entirety is of utmost importance to Dr. Aceta. Give Dr. Aceta a call for your obstetrics and gynecological needs at 661-695-6617.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-on Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands-on Apologetics. We are chatting with Master Apologist Pat Flynn of chroniclesofstrength.com. And check it out, folks. Lots of great stuff on that channel. And we're talking about the category barrier, breaking the category barrier. Is it possible for atheism to do that? And Pat, I love the analogy you gave of if all you have are white Legos, it doesn't matter how long you have to construct it or how many Legos you have, you'll never make a green castle or whatever. And we talked about morality. We've talked about consciousness. Let me throw something at you, because I know this is often used in theistic and atheistic debates. I tend to stay away from the science thing and focus more on philosophy. But some people would say that there seems to be a kind of category barrier in terms of how inorganic matter is able to produce organic matter. Would that fall in that?
Yeah, no, I mean, there very well might be. That might be something that we want to explore further. And I would say from a philosophy of nature standpoint, this is where something like Aristotelian forms might be extremely fruitful and productive. What is really fundamental at the end of the day, in some sense, and there's other bigger questions of like, what is causality exactly as well. So that's something we could explore now, but I think that would probably depend on, we would need a full episode to do any justice to that, right?
Yeah, but how about this? As advice to somebody who maybe is just starting out in apologetics, maybe they have a few good proofs for the existence of God, would that be an area that you would encourage them to explore, or would you say hold off and look at other areas?
And so if you're just starting out in apologetics and you want to get so philosophy of nature can get very technical and complex. In fact, it's one of my favorite areas of study, and it's funny you brought it up because I have this book right here for people who aren't watching. It's Neo-Aristotelian Perspectives on Contemporary Science. It's a really wonderful companion with some really brilliant contributors like Robert Koons in there who explore questions like the ones that you're asking right now. Mm-hmm. I would recommend starting with metaphysics first, but at the same time, when you're doing metaphysics, you are constantly kind of bumping up against questions like that and saying, okay, does this at least fit in a broad sense with various scientific discoveries or scientific understandings of the world? So I think you're at least going to have to peek in there every now and then. But I think, I would say start with the metaphysics. As a budding philosopher, study Aristotle, Aquinas, and the contemporary thinkers in that regard. I'm not sure if that's answering your question directly or not.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So you also mentioned contingency. What did you mean by contingency posing a barrier for atheists?
Right. So when we talk about contingency, we mean that something really just doesn't have self-existence, right? It doesn't exist in virtue of what it is. It could not have existed at all. It could have been otherwise. And in the same sense that if everything is contingent, are we going to be able to kind of like stack all that up? Can we just have more contingent things? Maybe even an infinite amount of contingent things, and somehow get a self-sufficient or independent reality. And we talked about this a little bit last time, so I don't want to rehash the entire argument. But reality itself is independent. It is self-sufficient, right? So like whatever else reality is, think of like my friend Josh Rasmussen, who calls it the blob of everything, right? It can't have a cause. It can't stand in a dependency relationship because outside of everything, there's nothing, right? So we have this kind of interesting paradox here where it's like, okay, that thing is contingent and caused. That thing is contingent and caused. Could everything be contingent and caused? And we realize no, it definitely can't be, right? So here we kind of have another construction problem, right? Because it seems like most of the things that we encounter or think about are contingent realities. But could we ever stack contingent realities up? Could we ever arrange them in a certain way, in a line, in a circle? I know we talked about causal loops last time, and a sort of layered matrices or whatever, and somehow produce a self-sufficient reality. And in the same, and I think we're back to that Lego block problem, right? No, if the causal property in question isn't somehow possessed inherently by at least something in that collection, it seems like we're always going to have just a collection of things that could be, but don't have their conditions for existence fulfilled. And then we've got another issue. So we need something that exists independently and eternally and necessarily. And this to make sense of why anything exists at all. That's a sort of primary way of staging the contingency argument. Now here, theists and atheists might actually be able to agree at this point. And it seems like there's been a lot of progress in philosophy of religion on this specific issue of the issue of necessary existence, where there really is kind of moving the ball down the field towards necessary existence, where more people who were initially skeptical are saying, it seems like we do need something necessary to ultimately ground or explain why there is any contingent order at all. So if that's something that wants to be conceded by the skeptic, great. Again, I think more progress is being made, and then we can come together and kind of probe the foundations of that and ask, well, what could that thing be? What might that thing be? And I would argue it can only be God. But at the other hand, if somebody wants to just kind of stay in the order of contingency, especially if they want to kind of rest on brute facts, that there's just contingency all the way through, I think you're going to be committed to the absurd result that literally nothing exists. I mean, forget consciousness at this point. Like we're just like nothing exists, which to me that's just not even possible, right?
That certainly is much more problematic, isn't it?
And there's fewer people that want to. There's been a few obscure people I can think of that I've encountered that do take that radical position that nothing exists. But then they kind of unpack it a little bit, and they don't really mean what you think they mean when they unpack it, right? So contingency is less of a clear example, I think, than the other two. But same thing. I think contingency is going to always cry out for necessity. And necessity is always going to get you to God.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it's funny how the Lego analogy just seems to work when it comes to this issue, because if all the Legos are contingent, how can you build any kind of structure that would be necessary if it's contingent through and through? It just doesn't seem to make sense even on the level of imagination.
No, it really doesn't. And again, you can think about this, maybe in a stronger or weaker form. Maybe you think it's impossible that there only be contingent things. That's my position. I don't think that it's possible that there's only contingent things. Or you might just think, probabilistically. So whatever serves you where you're at. And again, I've kind of moved on all of these positions where at least I thought it was just vastly improbable, to the point where, I don't think unless we have, God at the foundation, we're going to have consciousness or moral communities or a moral standard or even a contingent realm. Because I think ultimately you're only going to explain a contingent realm by a necessarily existing thing that has the freedom to create, but need not have created. If you have a necessarily existing thing that just acts out of necessity towards a creation, well, then everything would be necessary. We wouldn't have contingency. So I want to, I would probably want to say that the only way we're going to make sense of contingency is we have a necessarily existing thing that did create but need not have created.
Yeah, it's very good. Real quick, we only have a couple of minutes. Let's talk a little bit about brute facts. Couldn't somebody just say, well, there some things necessarily exist as just a brute fact, and that's all there is to it?
Yeah, so a quick couple responses to the brute fact objection. One is, if you start letting in a little bruteness, as Ed Fazer calls it, right, the whole picture becomes unintelligible. Because if things can just happen for no reason whatsoever, well, maybe so do your cognitive states. Maybe so do your beliefs. So maybe you think that you have good reasons for believing the things you do, but maybe you just believe them for no reason at all whatsoever. Now, you might think that that's improbable, but as somebody like Alex Proust would say, all probabilities essentially assume that there are no brute facts, right? As soon as you start letting brute facts in, all probabilistic reasoning goes out the window. So it might not even be improbable that you're just having this brute cognitive state that has no connection to any reasons or deeper reality, in which sense you should be dubious and doubtful of all your beliefs, including your belief in brute facts. So you're going to quickly kind of enter in this sort of epistemological self-defeat problem. There's other ways to kind of remove brute facts. I do that a little bit more in my my ebook, How to Think About God. But that's just a quick way to get around it. You're just going to have insurmountable, I think, you're going to enter into a radical skepticism if you try to bring brute facts in. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very good. Well, hey, in the last couple of minutes left, let's talk a little bit about your free ebook. Where can people get it? What does it include?
Yes, indeed. Yes, it's a small little ebook, and it's a snippet of a larger project I'm working on on natural theology, arguments for God. And it's called How to Think About God. As we mentioned last time, I borrowed that title from Mortimer Adler because his book was one of the first that I read on natural theology. And in this short ebook, it's only about 40 pages long, I just give a contemporary, Thomistic-ish argument for God's existence. And I call it contemporary because I borrow insights from Aquinas and Plato and Aristotle, but also from many other contemporary thinkers as well, like Bernard Lonergan and Josh Rasmussen and Robert Spitzer and people like that, just to give a formulation that I think sidesteps some very common objections and just, engages with the contemporary debate. And yeah, so it's on Amazon. It's just $1. It's a whole whopping $1 because mostly I'm just trying to get some of this out there, so it gives me all the more incentive to finish the full project.
Yeah, very good. So it's available on Amazon, and just look up Pat Flynn, or what's the best way to find it?
Yeah, so you can get Adler's book of the same title, but just make sure you put Pat Flynn in if you want mine. So How to Think About God by Pat Flynn. Yep.
Yeah, very good. And also to all the other stuff, I know that you pair up with Eric Robinson also. Where can we check that out?
Yeah, so my podcast is The Pat Flynn Show. And like you said, I have many great guests on there. You've been a guest at least twice from what I remember. And my buddy Eric, who's been a guest on this show, usually co-hosts my Sunday school episodes. And we just dive into all matters theology and philosophy there. So The Pat Flynn Show.
Awesome. All right, check it out, folks. Thank you, Pat, for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Always a joy. Thanks, Gary.
All right, Pat Flynn, ladies and gentlemen, chroniclesofstrength.com. Check it out. It's time for us to shut down the Midwest Command Center, turn off the dojo lights, but never fear, Terry and Jesse will soon be here with the Terry and Jesse Show coming up next. Also, thank you so much for listening. Truly appreciate it. And God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow to do this thing we call Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a great day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.